Yeah, be ready. Let's say Brexit wasn't an issue in this election. Let's say the referendum never had happened.
Uh-huh.
What would
Well, the
this?
answer to that is we wouldn't be having an election. Okay.
Yeah.
The only reason why we've had the 2017 election and the 2017 election is because of Brexit. Presumably, if indeed the Conservatives had won in 2015 without the promise of a referendum, David Cameron would probably be still Prime Minister, albeit now coming to the end of his premiership because he had said that he was not seek another term. And, this is around the time when we would be speculating about when he was going to stand down in order to enable a new leader to be able to take over the reins in time for an election following May. Now, of course, it may well be that that person might have been Boris Johnson, and to that extent at least, maybe the path of history would have ended up pointing in the same direction. But we wouldn't be having an election now, we'd be having an election next spring.
And touching on tactical voting, and seeing another potential Michael Portillo moment from 1997 when Stephen Twigg beat Michael Portillo due to tactical voting. Do you think we'll see more of that in this election?
Well, it's no doubt the $64,000 question. I mean, all the discussion about tactical voting is essentially driven by the fundamental weakness that the Remain side have in this election, which is that the Remain vote is divided amongst a number of parties, principally Labour and the Democrats, whereas the Leave vote is concentrated behind the Tories. And it's that differential concentration that creates the Tories' majority. So inevitably, those on the Remain side of the argument who are more concerned to see Brexit stopped rather than being concerned about whether or not the Labour gets a majority or not, or how well the Democrats do, are trying to encourage people to vote tactically against the Conservatives. Very difficult to tell from the polls as to how successful they are. One poll in the last week or so has said that about 8% of people are voting tactically. Another suggests it's closer to 20%. One poll suggests that Remain voters are no more likely than Leave voters to be voting tactically. Another one suggests that they are more likely to do so. So it's very, very difficult to evaluate how much role tactical vote is going to play, not least because experience suggests that decisions to vote tactically are often made quite late in the day, and that's one of the things where people's last-minute decisions
How late in
could
the
be
day?
important. Well, now from now about now on, we're now
Just literally on the ballot
as we're
box.
talking. Well, no, as we're talking now, it's Tuesday. So today, tomorrow is when perhaps disproportionate, at least, tactical voters are very likely to be made. But certainly, if the average lead in the polls is roughly right, we probably would need tactical voting on an unprecedented scale, even greater than that in 1997, which was the kind of previous high point, if indeed it's going to deny the Conservatives a majority. Now, if the Tory lead proves to be lower, then maybe it will make a difference. But tactical voting at the end of the day is usually something that's done by a relatively small number of people, but potentially with quite important effects because they do it in certain places where it can make a difference. So it's very difficult for surveys to pick up. And to be honest, we're really going to have to wait until the results themselves, until we actually see whether or not tactical considerations have made a significant difference or not.
And you've predicted the last two elections.
Well, not at this point in time.
accurately.
Not at this point in time. Can I simply point out I have no particular divine inspiration. What we do is we do the exit poll, and the exit poll provides us you collect data using a certain method, from which we attempt to forecast the outcome in terms of seats. But as of today, I know no more than anybody else as to what's going to happen.
Right, and on polls and conspiracy theories surrounding polls, especially within certain sides of the political spectrum, whether it be on the left or the right. And when polls come out, people are very skeptical of the fact that the polls are very one-sided, even though the polls have been accurate in the past. What have you made of all that, especially in this election?
Well, I mean, let me just debunk the conspiracy theory by pointing out one quite striking contrast. If you take the polls that appeared in the newspapers this past Sunday, the poll with the largest Tory lead was for a left-leaning newspaper, The Observer. The poll with the smallest lead was for the Conservatives' house magazine, The Sunday Telegraph. The idea that opinion polls are inspired by people's political position or whatever is nonsense. At the end of the day, the opinion polls make their reputation by getting it right, not by coming up with something or other that happens to please the political predilections of those who are paying for them.
Right. And the rise of smaller parties and their role in the elections and their increasing roles in forming coalitions with the much larger parties we see with the Lib Dems in 2010 and with the DUP in Theresa May's government. How likely do you think that will be in the near future?
Well, I mean, there have been fundamental changes in the way in which our electoral system operates. It is no longer as effective as it once was at keeping third parties out of the House of Commons. We may end up with more third-party MPs than we've ever had before. We're certainly going quite close to that target. So that inevitably, the more third-party MPs you have, the greater probability you're going to get a hung parliament. The second thing which is true, and frankly has been true now for about 30 years, is that there are fewer marginal seats between Labour and the Conservatives. So you need quite large leads, putting those two things together. You need quite large leads, which is why, for example, in this election we are saying, well, actually, probably to get an overall majority, the Conservatives need at least a 6-point lead. After all, David Cameron got a 7-point lead in 2015. He only got an overall majority of 12. And we are basically in that, more or less, that same situation now. And the truth is, our single-member party electoral system doesn't generate majorities as easily and as effectively as it once did because of those two changes in our electoral geography. And whether or not we get a hung parliament this time, will indicate it just depends on whether or not the Conservative lead over Labour is as large as the polling average, or whether it's less than that. But if it's less than that, we'll certainly be looking at a small majority, and maybe we'll be looking at another hung parliament. That's just now the reality of electoral politics in the UK.
And touching on tactical voting and people's voting preferences, do polls affect voting behaviour?
Yes, to some degree, but the truth is that there was a lovely article, it's now about 20 years ago now, but looking at this, and basically the conclusion of the authors was that for every poll or every election where you could argue that the polls had a bandwagon effect, i.e. people tend to pile in behind the winner, and that the party that was ahead tended to gain ground during the campaign, there was another election where you could argue that the polls had an underdog effect, i.e. that the party that was further behind seemed to make progress. So there's no consistent pattern as to the extent to which polls are going to affect people. The one area where clearly it could potentially affect people in this election is indeed providing the impetus for some Remain voters to vote tactically. Although at the end of the day, I mean, because of the limitations of polls, there are a number of constituencies where nobody can be entirely sure whether the Liberal Democrats or Labour are going to be the best place to defeat the Conservatives. There's been disagreements between some of the tactical voting websites as to which is second. So inevitably that is going to be something of a limitation. But that's one of the ways in which polls can certainly provide voters with information that some at least might want to use. But don't exaggerate the extent to which the outside world out there is following the details of the polls, with any great detail. At the end of the day, most people are going to make up their minds how to vote on the basis of who they actually want to win the election.
Yeah, and in this election, there's been a lot of issues surrounding the impartiality of the media and journalists specifically. Do you think that's had an impact on...
Look, there's nothing new about having a partisan media. One of the things that's been distinctive about this country for many years has been it has a very partisan newspaper industry, and now we also have lots of partisan outlets on all sides of the argument on social media. There is nothing new about having a partisan media in this country. It's been one of the distinctive characteristics of the British media and of British politics since at least the 1960s and 1970s. So sure, of course, lots of partisan media, but we've always had lots of partisan media. It's just shifted from being in print media and newspapers to being online, but it's the same game and it's the same phenomenon.
Right, and the final ultimate question, a few days out.
Yeah.
What is the likely outcome of this
election? The most likely outcome of this election is inevitably, given the evidence of the polls for what it's worth, that the Conservatives will get a reasonable overall majority. But they're not so far. With a 10-point average lead, they're not sufficiently far ahead of where the Conservatives, of where they need to be in order to get an overall majority. You know, as we said, it's probably at least 6 points, possibly a bit more, and that's not in, that doesn't give you much room for comfort and much room for safety, and therefore we cannot rule out the possibility that we will end up with some kind of hung parliament. And of course, politically, a hung parliament could have very, very different implications. The Conservatives need to win an overall majority in order to get the withdrawal treaty through, because they're the only party that's in favour of the Prime Minister's withdrawal bill. The moment they don't have a majority inside the House of Commons, then the Conservatives are going to be difficulty about getting the withdrawal treaty through. And if their number of seats goes down a little bit below that, then we end up with a majority of MPs who are in favour of a second referendum, and we may therefore end up with a minority Labour administration whose principal task is indeed to hold a referendum on Brexit. So it's all potentially very, very much on a knife edge, and certainly, you know, a fundamental crucial decision this country is going to make could depend on the outcome in a relatively small number of seats as to whether which either do or don't take the Tories over the line.
Thank you, John.
Okay, you're welcome. Fine. Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Very good. Very efficient.
How was that?